The island of Tinian burned under the Pacific sun, August 1944. In a concrete bunker that had once stored Japanese medical supplies, 8 women huddled in darkness that smelled of antiseptic, blood, and the acrid smoke of distant artillery. They were nurses of the Imperial Japanese Army, and they were about to make a choice that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Keiko Yamamoto, 23-year-old girl with hands that still trembled from amputating a soldier's leg 3 days prior, pressed her palm against the bunker's wall. The concrete vibrated with each explosion. American shells, American voices, American victory, inevitable as the tide. "They're coming," whispered Nurse Reiko, the youngest at barely 18. Her face was gaunt, cheekbones sharp enough to cut paper. They'd been surviving on rainwater and stolen rations for 2 weeks, ever since their field hospital had been overrun. "We should use the grenades, like we promised." The promise. They'd all made it, standing in neat rows at the Tokyo Naval Hospital before deployment. Every nurse had sworn an oath, hand over heart, eyes forward. Death before dishonor. Death before capture. Because capture meant things worse than death, things the propaganda films had shown them in explicit, horrifying detail. American soldiers, they'd been told, were animals who wore human skin. They raped, tortured, mutilated. They collected ears and teeth as trophies. They laughed while they did unspeakable things. But before we go deeper into Keiko's impossible decision, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. We're uncovering stories that history textbooks glossed over, stories that challenge everything we thought we knew about war, humanity, and the lies we tell ourselves. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. These stories need to travel far and wide because the truth matters, even 79 years later. Now, back to that bunker on Tinian, where 8 women faced a choice between 2 kinds of death. Part 1. The Weight of Propaganda. Keiko had believed every word of the propaganda. Why wouldn't she? Her instructors at nursing school had been serious men with medals on their chests, men who'd seen combat, men who knew. They'd shown films of American brutality in China, in the Philippines. They'd displayed photographs too graphic for young women to see, or so they said, but the implications were clear enough. "The Americans are not like us," her commanding officer, Lieutenant Sato, had explained during their final briefing before shipping out. His face had been grave, paternal. "They don't understand honor. They don't value life. To them you are less than human. Objects, things to be used and discarded." Sato had given each of them a grenade, small and heavy, with a pin that could be pulled with shaking fingers. "If capture becomes inevitable," he'd said, "you know what to do. The Emperor will remember your sacrifice. Your families will be honored. But if you allow yourself to be taken alive..." He'd left the sentence unfinished, the silence more terrible than words. Keiko had taken the grenade with pride. She'd felt chosen, special, entrusted with the responsibility of protecting not just her life, but her honor, her family's honor, the honor of all Japan. The weight of it in her pocket had felt righteous. That was 6 months ago, before the island-hopping campaigns had turned into a meat grinder, before she'd held dying boys who cried for their mothers, boys whose intestines she'd tried to stuff back into their bodies while they screamed, before she'd amputated limbs with a handsaw because the surgical equipment had been destroyed in a bombing run, before the concept of honor had started to feel abstract, meaningless, compared to the very concrete reality of blood and bone and the animal desperation to survive one more hour. Now, in the bunker, Nurse Michiko held her grenade in both hands like a sacred object. Michiko was 31, the oldest, a veteran of the Manchurian campaign. She'd seen things that made the rest of them look like children playing at war. "When I pull the pin," Michiko said, her voice steady, "we go together, clean, quick. We'll be heroes." "We'll be dead," Keiko heard herself say. The words surprised her. Where had they come from? What part of her, what still living part, had dared to speak them? Michiko's eyes flashed. "You'd rather be defiled? Destroyed? You'd rather your family receive word that you surrendered like a coward?" My family, Keiko said slowly, will receive word that I died either way. At least if we're alive, there's a chance they'll get the truth someday. The truth? Michiko laughed, a sound like breaking glass. The truth is what we were told. Americans are monsters. That's not propaganda, that's reality. I've seen what they do. Have you? Keiko's voice was sharper now. Have you actually seen it? Or have you seen photographs that could have shown anything? Films that could have been from anywhere? I've been thinking about it, Michiko-san. In 6 months of combat, I've never once seen an American soldier. Not up close. Just shells falling from the sky. Just distant figures in uniforms. What if we've been lied to about what happens when we meet them face to face? The silence in the bunker was absolute. The other nurses stared at Keiko as if she'd blasphemed, which perhaps she had. To question the propaganda was to question everything. The war, the emperor, the very fabric of reality they'd wrapped around themselves to survive. Then, through the concrete, through the smoke and chaos, a voice. Speaking Japanese. Not perfect Japanese. Accented, careful, the grammar slightly formal, but understandable, unmistakable. Nurses of the Imperial Japanese Army, we know you are in the medical bunker. We have water. We have food. We have medical supplies. Please come out. You will not be harmed. I repeat, you will not be harmed. This is a guarantee under the Geneva Convention, which the United States military follows strictly. The voice belonged to a woman, an American woman speaking Japanese. The impossibility of it made Keiko's head spin. How could Americans speak Japanese? How could the enemy know their language, understand their words unless they'd been preparing for this, unless they'd been learning, studying, treating Japanese people as human enough to communicate with? Monsters didn't learn their victims' language. Monsters didn't need to. It's a trick, Reiko whispered, her young face pale with terror. They'll say anything to get us out, and then they'll shoot us, Keiko said. Which is faster and cleaner than a grenade in an enclosed space, if you think about it. If they wanted us to suffer, they'd smoke us out or wait until we died of thirst, the voice continued, patient, almost gentle. My name is Sergeant Linda Takahashi. My parents were born in Hiroshima. They came to California in 1920. I grew up speaking Japanese at home. I understand your fear. I understand what you've been told. But I promise you, on my honor as a soldier and as a Japanese American, you will be treated with dignity and respect. Please, don't let fear make you do something you can't take back. A Japanese American. Keiko had heard of such people, had been told they were traitors, worse than Americans because they'd abandoned their heritage. But this woman's voice carried something that propaganda couldn't fake. Sincerity. Whether it was real or performed, it was there, undeniable. Michiko's thumb moved toward the grenade pin. It's now or never. Keiko's hand shot out, faster than thought, and grabbed Michiko's wrist. Wait, just wait. Give me 5 minutes, let me look. Look at what? At them. At what we've been told to fear. If I see monsters, I'll come back and we'll finish this. But if I see soldiers, just soldiers, then maybe we have a choice. The other nurses looked at each other. The weight of decision hung in the recycled air of the bunker like something physical, something that could crush them all. Finally, Nurse Sachiko, quiet Sachiko who rarely spoke, said, Let her look. What's 5 more minutes? We're dying here anyway. Keiko moved to the bunker entrance, a heavy metal door that had been barricaded with medical supply crates. She pushed them aside, her arms weak from malnutrition, but adrenaline lending her strength. The door creaked open, and sunlight stabbed into the darkness like knives. She emerged with her hands raised, squinting against the Pacific brightness, waiting for the gunfire that would prove her gamble had been wrong, that Michiko had been right, that they should have died with their honor intact. The gunfire never came, fire never. Instead, she saw American soldiers, dozens of them, weapons lowered, faces sweating in the tropical heat. Young faces, tired faces, some curious, some bored, some showing something that looked disturbingly like concern. And standing at the front, a woman in an American uniform with sergeant stripes on her sleeves and Japanese features in her face. Sergeant Linda Takahashi, who stepped forward with a canteen in her hands and held it out like an offering. "Water," she said in English, then in Japanese. "It's clean. Please drink." Keiko stared at the canteen. Every instinct screamed that it was poisoned, drugged, a trick. But her lips were cracked, her tongue swollen, and the logical part of her brain, the part that had been trained in medicine and science, knew that if they'd wanted to kill her, they wouldn't need poison. A single bullet would suffice. She took the canteen, unscrewed the cap with shaking fingers, brought it to her lips and drank. The water was cold, impossibly cold, as if it had been kept on ice. It tasted like nothing, like purity, like life. Keiko drank until her stomach cramped, then lowered the canteen and looked at Sergeant Takahashi with new eyes. "The others," Keiko said in halting English, surprising herself. She'd studied English in school, had been good at it, though she'd hidden that skill during the war. Speaking the enemy's language had felt like treason. 7 others, inside, scared. "I know," Sergeant Takahashi said gently. "Will you tell them it's safe? Will you help me bring them out?" Keiko turned back to the bunker entrance, where she could see 7 pale faces peering from the darkness. She held up the canteen like evidence, proof of life, proof that the impossible might be possible. "Come out," she called in Japanese. "It's safe. I'm alive. The water is clean. They're not what we were told." One by one they emerged. Reiko first, then Sachiko, then the others. Michiko came last, still clutching her grenade, her face set in rigid defiance. But when an American medic, a corporal with red crosses on his helmet, immediately began examining Reiko's infected arm wound, cleaning it with practiced efficiency, and murmuring what sounded like reassurances in terrible Japanese, even Michiko's grip loosened. The grenade fell to the ground, landed in the dirt with a soft thud that didn't detonate, didn't end the world. It just lay there, inert, one more piece of unused ordnance in a war that was already lost. Part 2. The long journey to confusion. They were transported on a ship called the USS Mercy, a hospital vessel painted white with red crosses that made it theoretically immune to attack under international law. Keiko had never heard of such a concept before, a ship specifically for healing, off limits to combat. It seemed fantastical, wasteful. Japan had no such ships. Every vessel was fair game, every resource bent toward destruction. The ship had clean beds with white sheets that smelled of bleach and soap. It had bathrooms with running water, toilets that flushed, showers that produced hot water on command. The first time Keiko stood under a hot shower, feeling 6 months of grime and blood wash away, she wept. Not from relief, from confusion. From the growing, terrible suspicion that everything she'd believed was wrong. The American nurses who tended to them were professional, kind, efficient. They checked vitals, administered antibiotics for infections, provided clean clothes. They smiled, though the smiles were often strained, awkward. Keiko understood. These women were tending to the enemy. How did you reconcile compassion with combat? How did you care for someone you'd been taught to hate? Sergeant Takahashi served as translator and intermediary. She explained that they were being taken to the continental United States, to a POW camp in New Mexico, where they would be held until the war ended. She explained the Geneva Convention, a set of international laws governing the treatment of prisoners. She explained that they had rights, legal protections, that they would be fed, clothed, housed, and allowed to send letters home through the Red Cross. It all sounded like fantasy, like propaganda in reverse. Keiko kept waiting for the mask to slip, for the cruelty to emerge. But days passed, and it never came. On the 3rd night at sea, Keiko found Sergeant Takahashi standing at the ship's rail, looking out at the moonlit Pacific. The translator's face, usually so carefully composed, looked sad in the silver light. Vulnerable. "May I ask you something?" Keiko said in English, her voice tentative. Takahashi looked surprised, then nodded. "Your English is good." I studied. Before. It felt wrong during the war, but I remembered. Nothing wrong with knowing languages. That's what lets us understand each other. Takahashi paused. What did you want to ask? Why do you do this? You're Japanese. Your parents were born in Japan. How can you fight against your own people? Takahashi's jaw tightened. My parents were born in Hiroshima, yes. But they left. They chose America. They became Americans. And when the war started, when Executive Order 9066 sent every Japanese American on the West Coast to internment camps, they went without protest because they believed in America's laws, even the unjust ones. They believed that if they proved their loyalty, showed they weren't threats, they'd be treated fairly eventually. Were they? My father died in the Manzanar camp. Pneumonia, inadequate medical care, inadequate everything. Takahashi's voice was flat, controlled, but Keiko could hear the ocean of grief beneath it. My mother is still there. I joined the army to prove we're loyal, to prove we belong. They made me a translator because that's all they trust us to do. We're Americans, but not American enough to fight. Only American enough to help interrogate prisoners. I'm sorry, Keiko said, and meant it. Don't be. I chose this. And every prisoner I help, every captured soldier or nurse I convince to surrender instead of committing suicide, is my answer to the people who say Japanese can't be trusted. Mercy is my revenge. Does that make sense? Keiko thought about it. Yes, she said finally. I think it does. They stood in silence, two women caught between worlds, watching the water that separated Japan from America, from everything they'd known, from everything they were becoming. Part 3. Arrival in the desert. The train journey across America lasted 3 days and revealed a country Keiko had never imagined. She'd been taught that America was struggling, weakened by war, desperate and crumbling. But through the train windows, she saw cities that gleamed in the sunlight, factories that churned with production, farmland that stretched to the horizon heavy with crops. She saw civilians who looked well-fed, well-dressed, going about their lives as if the war were something happening on another planet instead of a desperate struggle for survival. The disconnect was staggering. Japan had been at war for years, every resource bent toward the military, every civilian rationed and restricted and told to sacrifice for the nation. But America looked prosperous, abundant, as if the war were an inconvenience rather than an existential crisis. How? Keiko asked Sergeant Takahashi, who rode with them in their guarded train car. How can your country look like this while fighting on two fronts? Takahashi followed her gaze out the window. America is big, she said simply, and it hasn't been bombed. The war is happening over there, not here. That makes a difference. But the sacrifice... Americans are sacrificing. Just not everything. Not yet. Maybe not ever, if the war ends soon. Takahashi's voice was careful, neutral. Your country was already struggling before the war. Ours wasn't. That's not judgment, just fact. The fact felt like a betrayal. Keiko had been told that Japan's suffering was noble, necessary, shared by everyone. But if the enemy wasn't suffering, if they were winning without sacrifice, what did that say about the nobility of Japan's pain? The POW camp in New Mexico rose from the desert like an American mirage. Chain-link fences topped with barbed wire surrounded rows of wooden barracks painted olive drab. Guard towers stood at each corner, manned by soldiers with rifles. It looked like every prison camp from every propaganda film, and Keiko's stomach clenched with the old fear. But as they were processed through the gates, the strangeness continued. The camp commander, Colonel James Harrison, met them personally. He was a tall man in his 50s with gray hair and eyes that assessed them with professional detachment, not cruelty. Through Sergeant Takahashi, he explained the camp rules, the daily schedule, the work assignments available. His tone was formal but respectful. You are prisoners of war, he said, but you are also protected persons under international law. You will be treated humanely. You will have adequate food, water, shelter, and medical care. Any guard who violates these standards will be punished. Any prisoner who attempts escape will be detained, but not harmed. These are not my rules. These are America's rules. We follow them because we are a nation of laws. Laws, rules, structure. Keiko clung to these concepts like a drowning woman to driftwood. If there were rules, there were consequences for breaking them. If there were consequences, there was protection. Maybe. The barracks assigned to the female prisoners was separate from the main camp, a concession to gender and privacy. It had 12 beds with thin mattresses, a wood stove for heat, windows with screens. Basic, sparse, but clean. Keiko had lived in worse conditions in the field hospital on Tinian. That first evening, a truck arrived carrying dinner. American soldiers unloaded metal trays and brought them to the barracks, setting them on a long table. The smell hit Keiko before she saw the food. Meat, grease, sweetness, abundance. Hamburgers, French fries, Coca-Cola in glass bottles beaded with condensation. Apple pie with ice cream melting into the crust. The 8 nurses stood frozen, staring at the trays as if they'd been presented with evidence of alien life. This was more food than any of them had seen in months, maybe years. More food than Japanese civilians were getting back home, certainly more than the soldiers in the field had received. This was food for special occasions, for celebrations, for excess. And it was dinner. Just dinner. A regular meal in an American POW camp. Reiko reached out with trembling fingers and picked up a hamburger. She held it like something precious, examining the sesame seed bun, the beef patty, the cheese, lettuce, tomato, pickles. "What is this?" she whispered. "American food," Sergeant Takahashi said quietly. She'd stayed to help with the first meal, to answer questions, to ease the transition. "It's called a hamburger. It's very common here. Try it." Reiko took a tiny bite. Her eyes widened. She chewed slowly, swallowed, then took another bite, and another. And then she was eating with desperate hunger, tears streaming down her face, making small sobbing sounds as she chewed. The other nurses followed suit, all except Keiko. She stood rigid, watching her companions devour American plenty, and felt her world fracture completely. If this was how America fed its prisoners, how did it feed its soldiers? How did it feed its civilians? What vast reservoir of resources did this country possess that it could afford such abundance for captive enemies? And if America had this much, what did that say about Japan's chances of victory? What did it say about everything they'd been told about American weakness, American desperation, American inevitable defeat? Keiko's hands moved on their own, picking up the Coca-Cola bottle. The glass was cold, wet with condensation. She opened it, heard the hiss of carbonation, and brought it to her lips. The first sip was a revelation. Sweet, fizzing, cold, overwhelming. It tasted like nothing she'd ever experienced, like liquid sugar and bubbles and something sharp underneath. It tasted like excess, like decadence, like a country that could afford to make something this frivolous and distribute it to prisoners. The bottle slipped from Keiko's fingers. It hit the floor and shattered, spraying brown liquid and glass shards across the wooden planks. The sound was shockingly loud in the sudden silence, and Keiko broke. She doubled over, hands clutching her stomach, and sobbed. Great gasping sobs that came from somewhere so deep inside her that she'd forgotten that place existed. She cried for the boys she'd watched die, for the lies she'd believed, for her own complicity in a war machine that had chewed up her country and spit out nothing but ash. She cried for the hamburger she couldn't eat because eating it would mean accepting that everything she'd believed was wrong, and she wasn't ready, would never be ready for that. Sergeant Takahashi knelt beside her, careful not to touch, just present. "It's okay," she said softly in Japanese. "It's okay to be confused. It's okay to grieve. You're allowed to feel this." "We were told you were monsters," Keiko gasped between sobs. "We were told you'd do horrible things. We were told surrender was worse than death. And you give us hamburgers, you give us Coca-Cola. What kind of monsters do that?" "No kind," Takahashi said gently. "Because we're not monsters. We're just people who were also lied to about you. The difference is, our lies didn't make us cruel. They just made us afraid." Keiko looked up at her through tears. "What were you told about us?" that you were fanatics who'd fight to the last man, that you didn't value life, yours or anyone else's, that you were so brainwashed by your emperor that you couldn't think for yourselves, that capturing you would be impossible because you'd always choose death. Takahashi paused. Some of that was true. Some of you did choose death. But some of you chose life, chose uncertainty, chose to trust that maybe, just maybe, we weren't what you'd been told. That took more courage than dying. Around them, the other nurses had stopped eating. They sat in silence, holding their hamburgers and Coca-Colas, each lost in their own private reckoning with what this meal meant, what it revealed, what it destroyed. Michiko spoke first, her voice rough. My brother was at Guadalcanal. He died there. We received his ashes, though who knows if they were really his. Before he left, he made me promise that if I was ever captured, I'd kill myself rather than disgrace the family. I promised him, I swore. And now? Keiko asked. Keiko, now I'm eating a hamburger and I can't stop crying because it's delicious and I hate myself for thinking that. Michiko laughed, a sound like something breaking. I'm a traitor. We're all traitors. We surrendered. We're eating enemy food. We're alive when we should be dead. How do we live with that? No one had an answer. They finished their meals in silence, each bite an act of survival and betrayal, each swallow a choice to keep living in a world that no longer made sense. Part 4. The Rhythm of Captivity. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The POW camp developed its own rhythm, its own normalcy that felt surreal in its mundanity. Wake at dawn to the sound of a bugle. Breakfast that always came. Oatmeal, toast, sometimes bacon or eggs, coffee, orange juice. More food than they needed, always more than they needed. The abundance never stopped being startling. Work assignments were offered, not forced. The women could choose to help in the camp laundry, the kitchen, the garden that had been started behind their barracks. They were paid in camp scrip, fake money they could use at the commissary for toiletries, stationery, small luxuries. The concept of paying prisoners for work was bizarre, almost offensive. Prisoners were supposed to suffer, not earn wages. Keiko chose to work in the camp infirmary, helping the American medics with basic nursing tasks. It felt right to use her training, to do something useful. The head medic, Captain Robert Chen, was a Chinese-American doctor who'd been sent to the camp because, like Sergeant Takahashi, he looked Asian enough to make the white officers uncomfortable in combat zones, but was useful enough to keep around. They don't trust us to fight, Chen explained one day while they were restocking bandages, but they trust us to heal. Figure that one out. Do you resent it? Keiko asked. Every day, but I'm still saving lives, so it could be worse. He paused. My grandparents were killed in the Nanking massacre, Japanese soldiers. I should hate you probably, but you're just a nurse who got caught in the same machine that crushed my family. So what's the point of hate? Just makes more bodies. The camp had a small library, donated books in Japanese from universities and private collections. Keiko devoured them, starving for information, for context, for understanding. She read novels, poetry, histories. She read about the Geneva Convention, about international law, about the American concept of inalienable rights. She read about democracy, about checks and balances, about systems designed to prevent the concentration of absolute power. She read about what Japan had done in Asia, the rape of Nanking, comfort women, medical experiments, prisoner abuse that made American POW camps look like luxury hotels. She read testimonies, saw photographs, documentation that had been compiled by neutral observers and couldn't be dismissed as enemy propaganda. And she understood, with a sickness that settled into her bones, that her country had been the monster. Not exclusively, not uniquely, but undeniably. The righteous war she'd believed in had been conquest dressed up as liberation. The suffering she'd witnessed had been in service of atrocity. The hamburger moment, as she'd started thinking of it, had been the crack in the wall. But this was the wall crumbling completely, revealing the abyss behind it. She told no one what she was learning. The other nurses were coping in their own ways. Reiko had discovered American music, and spent hours listening to the radio, learning English through song lyrics. Sachiko taught herself to make origami from scrap paper, creating beautiful cranes that she gave to the guards as gifts, small bridges between worlds. Michiko had withdrawn into silence, working in the garden with methodical intensity, her hands always busy, her face carefully blank, but they all felt it. The slow dissolution of certainty, the growing awareness that they were alive because America had chosen to let them live, not because they deserved it or had earned it, but because America's rules said prisoners were to be kept alive. The power in that, the fundamental inequality of it, was crushing. In October, the mail started coming. Red Cross letters, censored and delayed, but real. Connections to home, to families who'd been told they were dead. Keiko's mother wrote in shaky handwriting. They said you died at Tinian. They held a funeral. We mourned. How can you be alive? What does this mean? Are you truly my daughter, or is this American trickery? Her mother didn't understand. Couldn't understand. The gap between what people in Japan believed and what Keiko was living was too vast to bridge in a letter that would be read by censors on both sides. Keiko wrote back carefully. I am alive. I am being treated fairly. I am not tortured. I am not starving. I hope this brings you peace instead of shame. I did not choose to survive. I simply did not choose to die. Please forgive me. She didn't know if the letter would ever reach her mother. Didn't know if her mother would want it to. Part 5. The Weight of Kindness. The true cruelty of the camp wasn't cruelty at all. It was kindness. It was the daily grinding reality of being treated with basic human decency by people who had every reason to treat them harshly and every cultural excuse to do so. The guards learned their names, not prisoner or enemy, but Keiko, Reiko, Sachiko, Michiko. They made small talk, asked about their days, shared pictures of families back home. They were young men, mostly, farm boys and city kids who'd been drafted or enlisted, who saw this assignment as boring but preferable to combat. They didn't hate the Japanese prisoners. They barely thought about them as Japanese. They were just people who'd been captured, same as anyone. This casualness, this normalcy, was harder to bear than cruelty would have been. Cruelty could be resisted, survived, used to reinforce the belief in American monstrosity. But kindness from monsters meant they weren't monsters, which meant everything else collapsed. In December, Christmas came. The camp was decorated with paper snowflakes made by prisoners, pine branches gathered from the mountains visible in the distance, lights strung along the barracks that glowed in the desert darkness. There was a special meal: turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes, pumpkin pie. A feast that made the regular abundant meals look sparse by comparison. Colonel Harrison visited each barracks personally, wishing prisoners a Merry Christmas through translators, handing out small gifts donated by churches and community groups. Soap, handkerchiefs, candy, books. Tokens that had been wrapped carefully by American civilians who would never meet the prisoners they were giving to, who did it simply because it was Christmas, and that's what you did at Christmas. You gave gifts, even to enemies. Keiko received a bar of lavender soap and a handkerchief embroidered with flowers. There was a note tucked inside, written in careful English. From the Ladies' Auxiliary of Albuquerque Methodist Church. May you find peace. God bless you. She stared at the note until the words blurred. American women, probably mothers, probably women who had sons or husbands fighting in the Pacific, had made these gifts for Japanese prisoners, had chosen compassion over hatred, had decided that even enemies deserved small kindnesses at Christmas. The generosity was unbearable. That night, Keiko found Sergeant Takahashi outside the barracks, smoking a cigarette and looking at the stars. The translator had become something like a friend over the months, a bridge between worlds, someone who understood the weight of being caught between cultures. I don't know how to be this person, Keiko said without preamble. I don't know how to be someone who surrendered, who ate hamburgers, who accepted Christmas gifts from the enemy. I don't know how to go home as this person. Takahashi took a long drag on her cigarette, exhaled slowly. You think you're going home? The question hung in the cold desert air. Keiko hadn't let herself think beyond the present, beyond the rhythm of camp life. But eventually, the war would end. Eventually, there would be repatriation, return, home. Wouldn't there? The war can't last forever, Keiko said. No, but the consequences will. Takahashi flicked ash from her cigarette. When you go back, if you go back, you'll be marked. Surrendered prisoner. That's a stain in Japanese culture, right? Worse for women. You'll be suspect, tainted, broken. People will wonder what the Americans did to you. They'll assume the worst. They'll treat you accordingly. You're saying I can never go home. I'm saying a home might not exist anymore. Not the way you remember it. Not for you. Takahashi paused. I can't go home either. I'm American, born in California, but after the internment camps, after being used as a translator while my father died in Manzanar, I don't know what home means anymore. Maybe home is something we carry inside us. Maybe it's something we have to build from scratch. I don't know. They stood in silence, two women made homeless by war, watching the stars that looked the same over Japan and America and everywhere else, indifferent to human suffering, to borders, to the lies that nations told themselves. Part 6. The news that changed everything. August 1945 arrived with rumors that swirled through the camp like dust devils. Something big had happened. Something unprecedented. The guards were tight-lipped, nervous. Colonel Harrison called an assembly. The prisoners gathered in the mess hall, hundreds of them, Japanese soldiers, sailors, a handful of civilians who'd been caught in war zones. The 8 nurses sat together, a small cluster of women in a sea of men, all of them tense with anticipation. Harrison stood at the front with Sergeant Takahashi beside him. His face was grave, aged. Whatever he was about to say had cost him something to learn. On August 6th, he began, pausing for Takahashi to translate, the United States dropped a new weapon on the city of Hiroshima. It's called an atomic bomb. It's unlike anything that has existed before. One bomb destroyed the entire city. Casualties are estimated between 70,000 and 100,000 people. Most died instantly. The silence in the mess hall was absolute. Not breathing, not moving, not existing. Just the words hanging in the air like fallout. 3 days later, Harrison continued, his voice flat, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, similar casualties, and today, August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender. The war is over. The world ended. Not with an explosion, though there had been explosions that ended cities, ended lives, ended the concept of what war could be. But for the prisoners in that mess hall, the world ended with the translation of those words. Unconditional surrender. Japan didn't surrender. Japan couldn't surrender. The emperor was divine. The nation was eternal. Death before dishonor was the code, the law, the only acceptable outcome. Except the emperor himself had spoken, had announced surrender, had chosen national survival over divine pride. If the emperor could surrender, what was sacred? If the nation could admit defeat, what was eternal? If living mattered more than dying with honor, what had all the dead died for? Men wept openly. Some screamed. One man, a former officer, stood up and began reciting the imperial rescript, the oath of loyalty to the emperor, as if words could unmake reality. Guards moved toward him, ready to restrain, but Colonel Harrison held up a hand. Let him speak, Harrison said quietly. He's earned the right to grieve. Among the nurses, Reiko had gone completely still, her young face blank with shock. Sachiko was crying silently, tears streaming down her cheeks. Michiko stood up and walked out of the mess hall, her movements mechanical, and no one tried to stop her. Keiko felt nothing. The numbness that had been growing in her since the Hamburger moment, since the Christmas gifts, since every act of American kindness that undermined everything she'd believed, finally consumed her completely. She was hollow, empty, a shell shaped like a woman with nothing inside. Sergeant Takahashi found her later, sitting outside the barracks, staring at the desert mountains. The translator's face was wet with tears, though she wasn't currently crying. just existing in the aftermath of crying, in the space where grief lived. My parents were from Hiroshima, Takahashi said. Her voice was hoarse. I don't know if they're alive. The internment camp released them 2 months ago, let them go back to California. But my mother had been talking about visiting relatives in Hiroshima. I don't know if she went. I don't know if she was there when she couldn't finish, didn't need to. The horror was implicit. Keiko looked at her. This woman who'd been so strong, so professional, so carefully balanced between two worlds. I'm sorry, she said. The words were inadequate. Everything was inadequate. The war is over, Takahashi said. We won. I should be happy. But all I can think about is my mother, about whether she died in an instant or whether she's dying now from radiation poisoning, and I don't even know what that means except that it's supposed to be worse than burning. How is that possible? How is anything worse than burning alive? They sat together in silence, two women on opposite sides of a war that had ended but would never be over, sharing grief that couldn't be divided by nationality or loyalty or anything else. Grief was just grief. Loss was just loss. Part 7. The Reckoning. The days after the surrender announcement were the hardest, not because conditions in the camp changed. They didn't. The meals still came, abundant and regular. The guards still called them by name, still treated them with professional courtesy. The work assignments continued. The library remained open. The routine persisted. But everything meant something different now. Before, they'd been prisoners of an ongoing war, temporary captives who would eventually be exchanged or released when Japan won. Now they were prisoners of a defeated nation, survivors of a lost cause, living evidence of Japan's failure and shame. Some men in the camp attempted suicide. Hangings in the barracks, slashed wrists in the bathrooms, one man who tried to provoke a guard into shooting him by attacking with a makeshift weapon. The guards didn't shoot. They restrained him, got him to the infirmary, had him watched constantly until the crisis passed. Even then, even when given justification for violence, the Americans chose mercy. It was maddening. Michiko disappeared for 3 days. They found her in the desert, miles from camp, dehydrated and sunburned and barely alive. She'd walked out during a work detail, just kept walking toward the mountains, intending to die of exposure. But the desert in August was brutal, and dying of thirst was harder than she'd imagined. Eventually she'd collapsed, and a patrol had found her. When she woke up in the infirmary, Keiko was sitting beside her bed. You should have let me die, Michiko whispered. Her lips were cracked, bleeding. The Americans wouldn't let you die, Keiko said. That's not how they work. They save people, even people who don't want to be saved. I can't go back to Japan like this, surrendered, saved by Americans, living when I should have died a dozen times over. I'm already dead in every way that matters. Keiko understood. She felt the same way most days, but she'd been thinking, reading, processing, and she'd come to a conclusion that felt both liberating and terrifying. Maybe we are dead, Keiko said slowly. Maybe we died in that bunker on Tinian, or should have died, and everything since has been a kind of afterlife. But if we're already dead, we have nothing left to lose. We can't bring more shame on ourselves because we're already maximally shamed, so we might as well live. We might as well see what happens next. We might as well bear witness. Bear witness to what? To the truth. To what actually happened, not what we were told happened. To the fact that the enemy fed us hamburgers and gave us Christmas gifts and saved us when we tried to die. Someone needs to remember that. Someone needs to tell the truth, even if no one wants to hear it. Michiko closed her eyes. That's a heavy burden. Heavier than dying? Maybe. Probably. I don't know anymore. Neither do I. But we're alive. We might as well mean something. The Red Cross letters intensified after the surrender. Families that had thought their daughters, sisters, wives were dead suddenly learned they were alive. The responses varied wildly. Some families wrote with joy, with relief, with desperate questions about when they'd come home. Some wrote with confusion, unable to reconcile the propaganda with the reality of survival. Some wrote with anger. with accusations of cowardice, with demands to know why they'd surrendered instead of dying with honor. And some didn't write at all. Those were the hardest responses to bear. The silence that meant shame was too great, that the family had already mourned and moved on, that a returned daughter would be an inconvenience, a reminder of failure. Reiko received a letter from her aunt. Her parents had died in the Tokyo firebombing that said simply, "It would have been better if you had died. Don't come home." Reiko read the letter once, folded it carefully, and walked to the barracks' wood stove. She fed the letter to the flames, watched it blacken and curl and disappear. Then she turned to the other nurses with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I guess I'll need to find a new life," she said brightly. "Any suggestions?" No one had suggestions. They were all facing the same impossible future: return to a homeland that didn't want them, or stay in a country that had been their enemy. There were no good options, only choices between different kinds of exile. Part 8. The Gifts That Complicated Everything. In October, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived at the camp addressed to the Japanese nurses. It came from a women's organization in Albuquerque, the same Methodist church group that had sent Christmas gifts. Inside was an invitation. The ladies of the Albuquerque Methodist Church Women's Auxiliary would like to invite the Japanese female prisoners of war to a tea social to be held at the church, with transportation and supervision provided by the U.S. Army. "We believe that women should know women regardless of nationality. We would be honored by your presence." Colonel Harrison delivered the invitation personally, through Sergeant Takahashi looking uncomfortable. "You're under no obligation to accept," he said. "This is entirely voluntary. But I think it might be good for you, and for them, a chance to meet as people, not as enemies." The 8 nurses looked at each other. The idea was absurd, dangerous, impossible. Meet with American civilians? Sit in a church? Drink tea with women whose sons or husbands they might have treated wounds inflicted by Japanese soldiers? "I'll go," Keiko heard herself say. "I want to meet them. I want to see who these people are who send gifts to prisoners." Slowly, the others nodded. Even Michiko, still weak from her desert attempt, agreed to come. Curiosity was stronger than fear. Or maybe they'd just lost the capacity for fear. When you'd already lost everything, what was left to lose? The church was a small building with white walls and a simple cross set among cottonwood trees that were turning gold in the autumn light. American women in their Sunday dresses stood outside, nervous and excited and clearly having second thoughts about this entire endeavor. The nurses climbed out of the army truck in their prisoner uniforms, simple dresses made from repurposed military fabric, and for a moment, the two groups just stared at each other across a divide that seemed wider than the Pacific. Then an older woman with white hair and kind eyes stepped forward. She didn't speak Japanese and the nurse's English was limited, but Sergeant Takahashi translated as the woman said, "Welcome. Thank you for coming. We're so glad you're here." The tea social was awkward, stilted, full of long pauses and misunderstandings. But it was also genuine. The American women had baked cookies, made sandwiches, prepared tea in their best china. They asked questions through the translator. "Where are you from? Do you have family? What was life like before the war?" Keiko found herself talking to a woman named Margaret, whose son was in the Navy, currently stationed in occupied Japan. Margaret showed a photograph. A young man in uniform, serious-faced, probably 22 or 23. "I worry about him," Margaret said through the translator. "I worry he'll come home changed, that he'll have seen too much, that the war will have taken something from him he can't get back." "He will be changed," Keiko said honestly. "War changes everyone, but not all change is destruction. Sometimes change is growth. Sometimes surviving means becoming someone new." Margaret looked at her with understanding that transcended language. "You speak from experience. I speak from survival." They sat in silence, sipping tea. Two mothers. Well, Margaret was a mother. Keiko was just imagining what motherhood might have been like in a different life, sharing the universal fear that war created, that the people you loved would be consumed by it, would return as strangers. would never return at all. At the end of the social, the church women gave each nurse a small package. Inside Keiko's was a sweater, hand-knitted in soft blue wool, along with a note. For the cold desert nights, may you be warm and safe. With Christian love, Margaret. On the truck ride back to camp, Reiko clutched her package, a knitted scarf and matching hat, and said quietly, "I don't understand. Why are they kind to us? We're the enemy." "We're the enemy," Sachiko corrected. "The war is over." "Is it?" Michiko's voice was bitter. "Or did it just change shape, from combat to this, whatever this is, psychological warfare by kindness?" "It's not warfare," Keiko said. "It's just human decency. That's what makes it so hard to process. We were taught that decency was exclusive to Japanese culture, that outsiders were barbarians. But these women made us tea. They gave us gifts. They treated us like people. That's not warfare, that's just who they are." "Then what does that make us?" Reiko asked. "If they're not barbarians, if we're not superior, if everything we believed was wrong, what does that make us?" No one answered. The truck drove through the desert as the sun set, painting the sky in colors that existed nowhere else on Earth, and the nurses held their gifts and grappled with questions that had no easy answers. Part 9. The Price of Truth. December 1945 brought word that repatriation would begin in the spring. Japanese prisoners would be transported back to Japan starting in March 1946. The war was over, occupation had begun, and it was time for the displaced to go home. Home. The word still felt foreign, impossible. Keiko spent her remaining months at the camp documenting everything. She wrote in notebooks purchased from the commissary with her work script, filling page after page with observations, conversations, the small details that revealed larger truths. She wrote about the Hamburgers and the Coca-Cola, about Christmas gifts and tea socials, about guards who learned their names and medics who treated them with respect. She wrote about the lies, too. The propaganda that had shaped them. The certainty that had led so many to choose death over surrender. The shame that still followed them, even in survival. She wrote about the complexity of being alive when you'd been taught that honor demanded death. About the cognitive dissonance of being treated well by people you'd been told were monsters. "What are you going to do with all that?" Sergeant Takahashi asked one evening. She'd become a regular visitor to the nurses' barracks during off-duty hours, this woman caught between worlds who seemed to find kinship with others similarly displaced. "I don't know," Keiko admitted. "Tell the truth, maybe. If anyone will listen." "They won't. Not in Japan. Not for years, maybe decades. The shame of surrender is too fresh. The need to blame someone for the loss is too strong. If you tell them Americans treated you well, they'll call you a liar or a traitor or brainwashed. The truth won't set you free. It'll just make you more isolated." "So I should lie? Pretend I was tortured? Give them what they expect?" Takahashi sighed. "I don't know what you should do. I'm just telling you what will happen. People don't want complicated truths. They want simple stories that confirm what they already believe. You'll be offering them complexity in a moment that demands simplicity." "Then I'll wait," Keiko said. "I'll write it down now while it's fresh, and I'll wait until someone is ready to hear it. Even if that takes 50 years. That's a long time to carry a burden." "Longer than dying?" Takahashi smiled sadly. "Everything is longer than dying. Dying is the easy part. It's living that takes real courage." In February, disaster struck. Well, not disaster exactly, but complication. The camp received word that some prisoners, those with special skills or those who'd cooperated extensively with authorities, might be eligible to remain in the United States if they chose. It was a technicality in the repatriation protocols, a loophole created by the need for translators, for people who could help with occupation efforts, for expertise that might be valuable in rebuilding relations between nations. Sergeant Takahashi delivered the news to the nurses with careful neutrality. "You're all trained medical professionals," she said. "There's a shortage of nurses in certain areas. If you wanted to apply for permission to stay, to work in hospitals here, there's a chance it could be approved. No guarantees, but a chance." The 8 nurses looked at each other. Stay in America? The country that had been their enemy? The place that had given them hamburgers and Christmas gifts and treated them with the kindness that had shattered their worldview? Stay where they weren't wanted but might be accepted, or return to where they belonged but wouldn't be welcomed? I'm staying, Reiko said immediately. I have nothing to go back to. My family is dead. My aunt told me not to come home. Here, at least, I could work. I could build something new. Why would I return to a place that doesn't want me? Sachiko nodded slowly. I think I want to stay too. I don't know if they'll let me, but I want to try. One by one, 6 of the 8 nurses decided to apply. Only Keiko and Michiko chose repatriation. I have to go back, Michiko explained. I have to face what I've become. Running away to America feels like the final betrayal. At least in Japan, I'll be among my own people, even if they hate me. Keiko's reasons were more complex. Someone needs to bear witness, she said. Someone needs to tell Japan what really happened here. Not the propaganda version, the true version. If I stay in America, I'm just another immigrant with a story. But if I go back, if I live there as a returned POW, I can show them that survival is possible. That shame doesn't have to be the end. That maybe, just maybe, we can learn from our mistakes instead of being destroyed by them. That's idealistic, Takahashi said. I know, but I've been nothing but cynical for months. I'd like to try idealism, see how it fits. The applications for the 6 nurses were processed through military bureaucracy, through immigration channels, through a maze of regulations that hadn't been designed for this situation. In the end, 4 were approved, Reiko and Sachiko, along with 2 others whose skills were deemed valuable. 2 were denied, told they'd need to return with the general repatriation. The camp held a farewell dinner in March, a last meal together before everyone scattered to their separate futures. Colonel Harrison gave a speech, translated by Sergeant Takahashi, about courage and survival, and the hope that understanding might prevent future wars. You came here as enemies, he said. You leave as people we've come to respect. That doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't undo the war. But it suggests that maybe, possibly, we can do better next time. That we can see each other as human before we see each other as enemy. That's worth something. The meal was steak, baked potatoes, salad, apple pie. American abundance one last time. Keiko ate slowly, memorizing the taste, knowing it would be years, maybe decades, before she had food like this again. Japan was starving. Occupation meant American food aid, but resources were scarce. Distribution was complicated, and returning POWs would be last priority for everything. After dinner, Sergeant Takahashi pulled Keiko aside. I got word about my mother, she said. Her voice was carefully controlled. She wasn't in Hiroshima when the bomb fell. She was in California. She's alive. That's wonderful, Keiko said and meant it. Yes, but she's broken. The internment camp, my father's death, the news about the bomb destroying her hometown, her family. She's alive, but she's not okay. I don't know if she'll ever be okay. Takahashi paused. I'm telling you this because you asked me once why I do this work. Why I help Japanese prisoners when Japanese soldiers killed my father. And I think the answer is because someone has to build bridges. Someone has to say that the cycle can stop. My mother can't do it. She's too damaged. My father can't do it. He's dead. But I can. You can. We can carry the weight so the next generation doesn't have to. That's a heavy burden, Keiko said, echoing Michiko's words from months ago. Yes, but it's the only way forward I can see. Revenge just creates more revenge. Hatred just breeds more hatred. So we build bridges, even when it hurts, even when no one thanks us, even when both sides think we're traitors. Because bridges are how people cross divides. They embraced, 2 women from opposite sides of a war, united by the understanding that survival meant carrying impossible weights with grace. Part 10. Return and Reckoning. The ship that carried Keiko and Michiko back to Japan was crowded, filthy, nothing like the clean hospital ship that had brought them to America. This was mass transportation, efficient and uncomfortable, designed to move bodies from one place to another without concern for dignity or comfort. The prisoners on board were a mix of soldiers, sailors, civilians, all united by defeat and the uncertain future ahead. Some were excited to return home, clinging to the belief that Japan would welcome them, would need them in the rebuilding. Others were silent, hollow-eyed, understanding that they were returning to a nation that had no use for survivors of a failed war. Keiko spent the voyage on deck when possible, watching the Pacific roll past, thinking about everything that had happened since she'd crossed this ocean the first time. She'd left Japan as a true believer, certain of national righteousness, ready to serve the empire. She was returning as something else, a witness, a survivor, someone who'd eaten hamburgers and accepted Christmas gifts and learned that enemy and human weren't mutually exclusive categories. They arrived in Yokohama in April 1946 to a gray sky and grayer welcome. No crowds, no families, just military officials processing paperwork and civilian police watching with suspicious eyes. The returned prisoners were documented, questioned, categorized. Where were you captured? What did you tell the Americans? Did you cooperate? Did you betray secrets? Keiko answered honestly. Yes, she'd cooperated. She'd worked in the camp infirmary. She'd attended a tea social with American civilians. She'd eaten American food, accepted American gifts, been treated with respect by American guards. She didn't lie. Didn't minimize, just stated facts. The officials wrote everything down with faces that revealed nothing. After hours of questioning, she was released with papers that identified her as a returned POW, along with an address for a refugee center where she could get temporary housing. Your family? An official asked. My mother is in Okinawa, I think, in a refugee camp. I'll find her. Good luck. The words were perfunctory, meaningless. The Tokyo that Keiko found was nothing like the Tokyo she'd left. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to ash by firebombing. People lived in shacks made from scrap metal and salvaged wood. Food lines stretched for blocks, thousands of people waiting for rations that were never enough. Children with swollen bellies from malnutrition begged on street corners. The emperor was still technically in power, but General MacArthur and the American occupation forces made the real decisions. Japan had survived, but barely, and it was surviving on American terms, with American food under American authority. The nation that had promised death before dishonor was alive and dishonored, and no one knew how to process that reality. Keiko made her way to the refugee center, a former school building now crowded with displaced people. She gave her name, her POW papers, and asked if there was any way to get a message to Okinawa to find her mother. The worker, a tired woman in her 40s, looked at the POW papers and her expression hardened. You were captured. Yes. You surrendered. Yes. The woman's voice dropped to a whisper. You should leave. People here, they don't understand. They lost everything while fighting to the end. If they find out you surrendered, that you're alive because you gave up, it won't be safe for you. Where should I go? Anywhere else. Maybe Osaka, maybe back to America if they'll take you. Just not here. Not where everyone is angry and looking for someone to blame. Keiko left the refugee center and walked through the ruins of Tokyo as the sun set. She passed groups of former soldiers, identifiable by their bearing even in civilian clothes, clustered around fires made from debris. She passed women who'd lost husbands, children who'd lost parents, everyone marked by loss and looking for meaning in it. She found a small shrine that had somehow survived the firebombing, its gates charred but standing. She went inside and sat in the empty courtyard, looking at the sky that was the same sky that had covered the POW camp in New Mexico, the same sky that covered America and Japan and everywhere else, indifferent to human suffering. She pulled out her notebooks, the documentation she'd kept of her time in captivity, page after page of truth that no one wanted to hear. She thought she could be a witness, could tell Japan what had really happened. But the refugee center worker had been right. No one was ready for complicated truth. They needed simple stories, brave Japanese fighting to the end, evil Americans committing atrocities. They needed to believe the loss had meaning, that the suffering had purpose. A hamburger and a Coca-Cola didn't fit that narrative. Christmas gifts from church ladies didn't fit. Guards who learned prisoners' names didn't fit. Keiko sat in the shrine as darkness fell and made a decision. She would keep the notebooks, but she wouldn't share them. Not yet. Not until Japan was ready to hear that mercy was possible, that enemy didn't mean monster, that sometimes the hardest thing wasn't dying for your country, but living after your country had led you into a senseless war. She would survive. She would bear witness. She would wait. And someday, maybe decades from now, someone would be ready to listen. Epilogue. The long view. Keiko found her mother 6 months later in a refugee camp outside Osaka. The reunion was complicated, emotional, full of tears and accusations and reconciliations that took weeks to work through. Her mother couldn't understand why Keiko had surrendered, couldn't reconcile the propaganda with the reality of her daughter being alive and relatively healthy. "They fed us hamburgers," Keiko said finally, when her mother demanded to know what had made her give up, what had made her betray everything they'd believed. Hamburgers? More food than I'd seen in months. Better food than Japanese soldiers got. Better food than civilians here are getting now. And I realized that if the enemy could feed prisoners that well, we'd already lost. The war was over before I surrendered. I just survived long enough to see it. Her mother didn't understand. Not really. But she accepted. What choice did she have? Her daughter was alive. In a nation of ghosts, of mourning, of collective trauma, having someone alive to hold was a gift, even if that person came wrapped in shame. Keiko found work eventually, in a hospital that was desperate enough for nurses that they didn't care about her POW status. She kept her head down, did her job, lived quietly. She sent letters to Reiko and Sachiko in America, learned that they'd found work, found lives, found something like peace in the country that had been their enemy. She kept the notebooks hidden, but she added to them. She documented post-war Japan, the occupation, the slow reconstruction, the way shame and trauma shaped a generation. She documented her mother's struggles, her own isolation, the way returned POWs were treated like invisible people, present but unacknowledged, and she waited. In 1952, the occupation ended. Japan regained sovereignty, began its economic recovery, started the long process of rebuilding not just infrastructure, but national identity. The shame began to fade, slowly, replaced by determination to never be defeated again. In 1965, Keiko was invited to speak at a conference on wartime experiences. 20 years had passed. A new generation was asking questions their parents couldn't answer. What really happened? What was it like? How did we survive? Keiko brought her notebooks. She stood in front of an audience of scholars, students, journalists, and she told the truth. About the hamburgers and the Coca-Cola, about Christmas gifts and tea socials, about guards who'd been kind and medics who'd been professional, and a system that had treated prisoners with dignity, even when it would have been easier to be cruel. "I'm not saying America was perfect," she said carefully. "I'm not saying the war was justified, or that occupation was easy, or that everything that happened was right. I'm saying that people are complicated, that enemy and human aren't opposites, that sometimes the hardest thing to accept is mercy from someone you've been taught to hate." The audience was silent. Some looked angry, uncomfortable with this narrative that didn't fit the preferred story of American brutality. Some looked thoughtful, processing, reconsidering. Some looked relieved, as if they'd been waiting for someone to say it was okay to admit that maybe, possibly, things had been more complex than propaganda allowed. After the speech, a young reporter approached her. "Do you think what happened to you was typical? Do you think other prisoners were treated this way?" "I don't know," Keiko said honestly. "I can only speak to my experience, but I think most Americans tried to follow their rules. Not all, not always, but enough that it mattered. Enough that we survived when we'd been told survival was impossible." The reporter took notes, asked more questions, eventually published an article that generated controversy and conversation. Some people accused Keiko of being brainwashed, of being a traitor, of spreading American propaganda. Others thanked her for telling a truth they'd suspected but couldn't voice. Keiko didn't try to convince anyone. She just kept telling her story, kept bearing witness, kept insisting that complexity was more honest than simplicity, even when simplicity was more comforting. She lived to be 93 years old, long enough to see Japan become an economic powerhouse, long enough to see former enemies become allies, long enough to see a world where the idea of another war between America and Japan seemed absurd, impossible, unthinkable. She published her notebooks as a memoir in 1987, 42 years after the war ended. It became a modest bestseller in Japan, required reading in some history courses, evidence that even the most total war left room for humanity if people chose to look for it. In the introduction, she wrote, "I was taught that Americans were monsters. They gave me a hamburger and shattered that belief. Everything that came after, the confusion, the shame, the slow rebuilding of understanding, started with that moment. With the realization that we'd been lied to about who our enemies were, which meant we'd been lied to about who we were. The hardest part of surviving war isn't the combat. It's living with the knowledge that you believed lies and acted on them and can't undo the damage done. All you can do is refuse to lie moving forward. To insist on truth even when it's complicated, even when it's painful, even when no one wants to hear it. That's the price of survival. That's the weight of being a witness. And I've carried it for 42 years because someone had to, because bridges don't build themselves, because the next war is prevented by people who remember the last one honestly, without romanticism or revision, just the complicated truth of what actually happened." The memoir was translated into English in 1989. Keiko received letters from American veterans who'd served as guards in POW camps, who thanked her for confirming that their efforts to be humane had mattered, had been noticed, had made a difference. She received letters from children and grandchildren of Japanese Americans, like Sergeant Linda Takahashi, who'd served as translators and medics and bridges between worlds. And she received a letter from Reiko, now in her 70s, living in California with her American husband and 3 children, working as a nurse at a hospital in San Francisco. "I read your book," Reiko wrote, "and I cried, because you captured it exactly. That moment when the hamburger and the Coca-Cola broke us open, made us question everything, forced us to reckon with the truth. I've lived in America for 44 years now. I've raised my children here. I've built a life here. And people always ask if I feel American or Japanese, as if I have to choose. But I'm both and neither. I'm someone who was shattered and rebuilt in a shape that doesn't fit either country completely. And that's okay. That's the price of surviving what we survived. We get to be complicated. We get to contain multitudes. We get to refuse simple categories." Keiko kept that letter until she died, along with her notebooks, along with photographs from the tea social and the Christmas gifts, and letters from her mother and from Sergeant Takahashi, who'd stayed in touch for decades. 2 women bound by having built a bridge during a war that demanded only destruction. On her deathbed, surrounded by family, her nieces and nephews, her mother having died years before, Keiko's last words were, "Tell the truth, even when it's complicated. Especially when it's complicated. That's how we honor the dead and protect the living." They buried her with a copy of her memoir, with the notebooks that had survived longer than the war, with the truth she'd spent a lifetime protecting and sharing and insisting mattered. The hamburger moment, as she'd always thought of it, had been the crack in the wall of certainty. Everything after had been learning to live in a world without walls, without certainty, with only the complicated truth that people were capable of both cruelty and mercy, and which one prevailed was a choice, not a destiny. That was the story she'd told. That was the witness she'd borne. And in the end, people listened. Not everyone, not immediately, but enough, eventually. Because the truth, no matter how complicated, has a weight that lies can never match. And witnesses, no matter how long they wait, eventually find an audience ready to hear. That's the hope, anyway. That's the story. That's what surviving the hamburger moment taught. That mercy is possible, that enemy is temporary, that truth is complicated, and that bearing witness to complexity is the hardest and most necessary work of all. The end.